Well, one of the most anticipated records of 2023 is just about to drop. So, will it meet the expectations or will it come out the animal in the back of the pack? Okay, I was really stretching for this one. Let's dive in. Fauna by Haken. So Haken, oh boy, for those uninitiative to the Haken family, Haken is a UK progressive metal outfit. They got their start in the early 2010s, dropping their first full-length album of Aquarius, and then following it up the year later with Visions, and then 2 years later after that, The Mountain. And these three albums really did solidify them as being the new kings on the mountain of progressive metal. By 2013, Haken had really solidified themselves as being the new masters of progressive metal. And unfortunately, the next three albums, Affinity, Vector, and Virus, didn't quite live up to the expectations. I mean, at that point, the big driving force of the band was really Richard Henschel, who basically wrote and crafted most of the music on the records. And so by then, with Affinity, more of the band members were starting to help out and really flesh out the albums and allowing for a little bit more credit. At this point with Fauna, I feel like we've already kind of crested a little bit of the wave of Haken. You know, what brought me to Haken's table was this big symphonic prog aspect in a technical metal landscape. And I feel as though they're moving further away from this big symphonic sounds from the 70s and embracing more of the technical side of things. And you saw that definitely with the double hitter of Vector Virus. And so as excited as I was for this next record, I was excited but with hesitation because I didn't know if they were going to continue down this overly technical, almost gent style of presentations, or if they were going to kind of return to form, so to speak. And what we have on Fauna, the next album, is kind of a continuation of the course. There is a little bit of a changeover of personnel. Diego, who used to be on keyboards, has left the band, citing creative differences, which is totally fair and totally understandable. I felt like the last couple of albums, he was trying to bring some of his more personality to the fold, but it didn't quite mesh, he was much more of a tone guy at the end of it. But they brought in the founding keyboardist of Peter Jones, and Peter brings that soundscapey aspect of it, the laying down of tones and atmosphere. Gone are the days of the big soaring dual guitar keyboard, styles. Which is a little bit of a shame, because Charlie Griffith, who is the other big guitarist on here with Richard Henschel, both of them are really so good at creating these massive, massive guitar solos that would play off of Diego as well as Peter. And I feel like that has been sacrificed for the technicality, creating really interesting time signatures and rhythm styles with the help of Ray Hearn, Ray on drums, and Connor Green on bass. And I mean, that is one thing that I will at least applaud this new iteration of the band, or at least where the band is going right now, is the technicality and the musicianship is top notch. Like this album, more so than any other album within the Haken discography, is so dense and so jammed packed with funky rhythm sections and odd time signatures and just moving from passage to passage to passage so quickly that it doesn't really allow for too much to come in. On top of all of this, we have Ross Jennings, the only person I haven't mentioned yet, on the vocals, and his vocals throughout this album are probably the best I've heard. He's really fine-tuned his craft to such an extent. I feel as though this album, as I mentioned, is the most dense, which meant that the first handful of listens, and in fact, the very first listen that I had with this record, I was very disappointed. Nothing stuck. I was going from one track to another track to another track, and it was just spaghetti on the wall that didn't really land with anything because of so much was going on. This kind of brings me to my biggest criticism of the album, is that the heart and emotional core of this album has been gutted to make room for how technical and how dense this record is. You know, they did trade one for the other instead of making room for both. And so because there doesn't have that emotional core or that emotional atmosphere to it, it leaves me not feeling a whole lot. You know, there's a lot of intellectually stimulating aspects about this album that I get really excited for. And I call it like brain candy, where my brain is like, ooh, that's really interesting. Ooh, that's really fun. But in terms of like emotional connectivity, it leaves me cold, you know? Like, unlike, say, Aquarius, Visions, or The Mountain, which had this really deep-rooted connectivity and emotional heart to it, and I would leave those albums with tears in my eyes, I can't really say I have that same kind of connectivity here. And even with a lot of that technical prowess that's on this, at least with albums like Affinity, Vector, and Virus, where there was moments, and sometimes a single moment, where I felt really connected. I was like, that's the Haken that I love. That's the music that I know that they're able to create and employ. That's what brings me to the table. There really wasn't a moment on this record that had that. You know, there wasn't that moment of connectivity on this record, even where those albums that are much more technical, like the Vector Virus duo, I didn't feel it on this one. Now, that's the biggest criticism that I have with this record. Let's talk about the things that I loved about this record. First off, this album is, like all of the Haken records, a concept album, but this one is much more a concept album like The Mountain was a concept album. It doesn't follow a narrative storyline like the Vector Virus, like Aquarius, Visions. It follows much more of a thematic concept. You know, each one is more aligned with like an animal spirit or an animal enterprise in that, and you can see that right from the titles of the tracks like Taurus, Nightingale, Elephants, Never Forget, and Eyes of Ebony. The last one being, talking about like the last male rhino dying. So the mortality of this species of rhino, staring them at the face because there's just the two females left and there's no way for them to procreate. Yeah, that's pretty heavy, man. And kind of paired with this is Richard Henshall's death of his father. You kind of have that kind of essence of, you know, man's role within the animal kingdom and where we fit, and how we as humans like to think we are removed from the animal kingdom, but really we're more savage and more animalistic than a lot of our animal cousins and counterparts. And you feel that within the music as well. The first two big tracks, Taurus and Nightingale, are massively hard-hitting tracks. You know, this is where we get that really dense, and we've already heard them, you know, they were released before the album was dropped. And I've really come to love Nightingale. When Nightingale first dropped, I was like, okay, I'm not all that excited for. You know, the first time I listened to it, they played it live because I try to avoid all the spoilers beforehand. But I do like how with more listens and more familiarity with the band, I'm getting a lot more essence and a lot more good vibes with this as well. And I'm finding that as well with some of the smaller tracks that at first I didn't really enjoy all that much. Alphabet of Me and Island in the Cloud, both of these tracks are much more like singer-songwriter, much more poppy in approach. You know, these are kind of like the more poppy tracks that we had from like Affinity. And I feel like people are either going to love these tracks or hate these tracks. And I'm kind of ambivalent about them. You know, there are moments that I really like, especially on Alphabet of Me, that feel very like indie pop rock. You know, it's a lot more electronic in that sense, but kind of rooted at the heart is this very technical, rhythmic stylings that, again, you're either going to take or you leave. It reminds me of something that like Radiohead was really playing with in the early 2000s. My favorite track is probably the fourth track of Sempterial Beings, I think is how you pronounce it. Not only am I dealing with my usual dyslexic pronunciation, but I'm also dealing with the COVID brain, which makes it very hard for me to think properly. But I've been loving this track, and I think part of that is the incorporation of a lot more of the atmosphere that I've really come to appreciate with this newer Haken. And Ross Jennings' voice on this track is better than anything that I've heard in a very long time from him. Like his ability to soar his voice so high just makes me drip with envy, and just like, it's so catchy, it's so immediate, but I love how like hard hitting and powerful it is. And that brings us to Beneath the White Rainbow, which is fine. Like, it's really hard hitting, but I do feel as though at this point in the album, it's kind of treading water. I feel like it's kind of using the same techniques and stylings that we already got with Taurus and Nightingale that I'm not all that excited for. As I was mentioning when I was talking about the Alphabet of Me, Island in the Clouds I enjoy because of some of the more interesting flavors we get with this. You know, they're not trying to blow down the doors with that heavy, really intense styles of metal, but I love how they're still able to have this smooth groove going on it. You know, there's one point where there's like a quick clap, and then we get into this really nice little jazzy moment with the guitars. And that is one thing that I do want to, again, praise with this album, is how smooth a lot of these tracks feel, even though we're going from passage to passage to passage really, really quickly. And that can really be felt with the smallest track on here, which is Love Bite. And I don't know. I'm not a big fan of this. It starts off super heavy and super intense, but then backs off into this really interesting slow groove style of track. And it's fine, but again, I still feel as though we're treading a little bit of water. The last track that I haven't talked about yet is the big track, the 11-minute Elephants Never Forget. And I feel like this was the track that the band was allowed to kind of let themselves get loose a little bit. You know, every track up to this point is so methodically thought out and perfectly placed that there wasn't a whole lot of wiggle room for any kind of interpretation or fun. And I feel like Elephants Never Forget is that first real track that they allow themselves to have that breathing space, that leg room. And I mean, the track opens up with a cut paste Gentle Giant riff with Ross Jennings on there. And it works very, very well. This is the fun that I don't think they've had since Affinity. And yeah, it's very interesting, very fun. It's going to be a highlight for a lot of people. I know a lot of us prog heads are going to really love it. And I definitely did myself. I just wish we had a little bit more on this record, you know, just a little bit more. So in the end, Fauna, I feel, was definitely a step up from what we've been getting within the past 4 or 5 years from the band, but we still haven't quite reached that same level of creative outpour that we had from their first 3 records. This one is a grower for sure. As I mentioned, this album disappointed me when I first listened to it, but much like a lot of the 70s dense records from Yes, King Crimson, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer that originally disappointed me, the more I listen to it, the more I love it and the more I get out of it. You know, I don't know where this path will lead. I don't know where my final, decision about this album will be at the end of the year, but where I stand now, it's definitely grown upon me, and to the point where I really look forward to every sit down that I have with this record. So yeah, I still feel very interested whenever I see a review where somebody's only had this record for like 2 or 3 listens and they already have their minds made up. Like, how do you do that? You need a long time with this record to really find all those nooks and crannies. So yeah, what I will say for my final rating of this record is Fauna by Haken is one I would absolutely pick up in physical format. Yeah, this one is a bop. It's a banger. I really do love getting into it, and the more I listen to it, the more I get out of it. I haven't quite reached the level, I haven't reached the point of diminished returns when I listen to this record, but I still don't feel that emotional connection that I'm really hoping for. So I'm hoping that the next record from Haken has that emotional core, has that emotional connection that I'm really hoping for. But until then, that's what I got. What do you guys think about this record? If I edit and upload as I hope, this record drops tomorrow. Otherwise, it's already out. So what do you guys think about this record? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. And yeah, let me know if it met your expectations, if it exceeded your expectations, if it fell short, whatever you thought about it. I'd love to hear what your take is on this album. Because yeah, I feel like this is the next chapter in their discography, because it is. So that's all I've got for you guys today, and I'll leave you with thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best, and until next time, notes out.